The Fascist State of Mind by Christopher Bollas, Genesis of Genocide, Being a Character. Part 2. Intellectual Genocide. Genocide is a word coined by the jurist Raphael Lemkin in 1944 from the Greek genos, tribal race, and the Latin side, killing. Lemkin found a word that linked up with tyrannicide and homicide, and thus inscribed itself in the symbolic order, enabling us finally to think about this crime. The process that leads to a fascist state of mind, group, or nation is unremarkable, and evidence of its emergence is easy to detect. I intend to list the features of what I shall term intellectual genocide, to name the mental processes precursor to, and eventually part of, the genocidal act. I do so, as will be clear toward the end of the chapter, not only out of interest in this problem, but because I think identification of ordinary genocide, the genocide of everyday life, may lead us towards self-scrutiny and confrontation of others when we see that an individual or a group has taken on this form of representation of the other. Because it is so ordinary, it is easily identifiable, but equally, because of its unremarkable status, it is also capable of emergence into mass murder. I start by differentiating between committive genocide, identifying its visible traits, and omittive genocide, which is an act of omission. Committive genocide. Distortion. In the early stages of a possible move to a fascist state of mind, the subject subtly distorts the view of the opponent, rendering it less intelligent or credible than hitherto. This is an ordinary part of debate, but in the extreme manifests itself as slander. Decontextualization. A point of view held by the opposition is taken out of its proper context, which recontextualized would make the content more credible. This is an ordinary part of debate, and the victim of decontextualization will naturally struggle to fill the gaps created by this rhetorical violence. The extreme of this act is the removal of a victim from his tribe, home, i.e., context, isolated for purposes of persecution. Denigration. The belittling of an opponent's view combines distortion and decontextualization, rendering the opponent's views ridiculous. This is a door through which effects of scorn and belittlement move and displace ideation as the machinery of conflict with the opposition. Caricature. This is the move from the denigration of the opponent's views to cartooning of the individual who presumably holds the views. Again, it is part of ordinary rhetoric to caricature the opposition's view, and yet it is a transfer from the view held to the holder of the view. It therefore represents a significant step in the identification of a person or group with ascribed undesirable qualities. Character assassination. This refers to the attempt to eliminate the opposition by discrediting the personal character of the holder of a view. An unacceptable form of debate, it is an ordinary part of discourse, usually referred to as gossip. This perfectly harmless act of character assassination, oh, I do love gossip. Tell me all about it, which discredits an opponent by conveying fictions or facts in a non-judicial place, notably where the victim cannot speak for himself, can eliminate a person from the scene of consideration. Change of name. Again, this is sometimes an acceptable part of debate, but with obviously more disturbing manifestations, kikes for Jews, guks for Vietnamese, that form part of the act of elimination of the proper name, precursor to the elimination of the person himself from the scene of consideration or from life itself. It is ordinary, what's his name? Thingy, sometimes acceptable, if tiresome, when a person's name is consciously distorted for humorous purposes, and maybe an unconscious parapraxis when the name is unknowingly altered. Categorization as aggregation. These terms, used by Cooper, are useful to define the moment when the individual is transferred to a mass in which he loses his identity. It may be ordinary. Oh, but of course she is Freudian. It may be permissible if dicey. Well, of course she is ill, or, well, he is a psychopath. Or it may be an extreme act of lumping together. He's a Jew. Omittive genocide. Absence of reference. This is an act of omission when the life, work, or culture of an individual or group is intentionally not referred to. Again, this is an ordinary feature of life. One group may get rid of the contributions of another group by never referring to them, or a writer such as Solzhenitsyn may be removed from bookshelves, or, in the extreme, there are no references to crimes against humanity. When a person or a group addresses the opposition in the terms outlined above, alarms should ring in the witnesses to such action, who may respond by not engaging in vicious gossip or by directly confronting an individual who distorts, decontextualizes, denigrates, or caricatures the holder of different views. Such confrontation aims to arrest, at the very least, intellectual genocide. It is ordinary. Yet, even in its purely rhetorical expression, it can be extremely destructive. If an individual or group, previously participant in discourse, is a ceaseless object of intellectual genocide, then the recipients will show the effects. Some will simply leave the scene, no longer partaking in the group, a kind of voluntary exile in the face of persecution. Some may be pushed to express extreme views, victims of a violent innocence, discussed in Chapter 8, who appear to have gone over the edge. Others may somatize the conflict. A heart attack, we know, is often the outcome of extreme duress in one's place of work. Others may attempt to form alliances with the persecutor in an effort to gain some form of protection against their own potential destruction. My point here is to raise intellectual genocide within our consciousness as a crime against humanity. Since it is ordinary, we can do something about it in the simple Freudian way of talking about it in the here and now, and therefore partly divesting the act of its potential by addressing it. The vicious circle. We could say that until Lemkin created a word for mass murder, genocide managed to elude the signifier and thus escaped its representation in a symbolic order. To this list of obstacles, I wish to add a few more. One of the most perplexing features of the success of intellectual genocide is that its most gifted practitioners not only seem to achieve places of prominence by viciously attacking others. Indeed, they also seem to become objects of endearment to those who otherwise, one would have thought, would be horrified by such behavior. I recall a right-wing political figure in my hometown in Southern California, a person who vilified the opposition, spread vicious gossip, and damaged many, many people. Yet he was almost loved as a kind of cute monster. I also recall, only a few miles down the road, another person known for his viciousness who was finding himself the object of endearment, Richard Nixon. And though we knew of Stalin's monstrosity, we still turned him into good old Uncle Joe. The puzzle is why we love these monstrous monsters rather than oppose them. Why are they allowed to climb so far up the ladder of success, sometimes to a place of leadership where they continue to eliminate the opposition in vicious ways? Perhaps they represent us. Perhaps we fear to challenge such an individual. There must be some truth to that, but I also think we observe an interpersonal sleight of hand in which the monster person is the impossible loved object, because love here exonerates the subject from responsible opposition. I wish I could stand up to Mary, but you know she's just impossible, and I'm afraid I love the old monster. Presumably, confrontation of the monster must be reserved for those who don't love the monster, and yet almost everyone gives the same shrug of the shoulder. How can Mary be challenged? She is Mary, and her very monstrous qualities, darn it, are what we kind of love about her. In some ways, this seems to me to be the interpersonal equivalent of creating a type of joke. Aggression, the anger or outrage evoked by such a person's behavior, is turned into humor. Mary becomes the basis of our laughter about the atrocious. But such an obstacle to confronting viciousness in a person, and in some cases the practice of intellectual genocide, is no laughing matter and deserves our continuing study. I consider this further through a personal vignette. I attended high school in Orange County, California, during the 1950s, and for a limited period of time it became compulsory for the students to attend Christian anti-communist crusades in, of all appropriate places, Disneyland, and usually with a visiting speaker, who now and then was Ronald Reagan. I particularly admired one of my history teachers, who struck me as an intelligent and very decent man. Yet in the weeks approaching such events, and most intensively at the crusade itself, he became rabid in his hate of the liberal conspiracy that was plotting to overthrow the U.S. government. I had not known his politics until then, and I recall being shocked at the utter transformation in his character whenever contemporary politics entered his mind. I think most of us were bewildered by him and by what I would now term a local psychotic state. But what we did is of interest. We turned this aspect of his behavior into a joke. He became our loved madman, and occasionally one or another of the group would push his button and send him across the boundary from the sane to the insane part of his personality. Discussing the vicious behavior of a person, people will often say, but you know, she really is quite a lovely and kind person, or, well, you know, removed from her pulpit, she is really quite a different person. And this is true, but it is not the point. In fact, this opposes the point. Humanity, the good parts of the self, is now used to excuse the destructive side of the self. The joke, as always, now borders on the perverse. The humane now authorizes the inhumane as Mary's viciousness is loved, in the economical exchange between the fascistic and the non-fascistic parts of her personality. Even if we accept that compliance with a Mary is in the interests of vicarious support of one's own viciousness, which will always be partly true, the act of dissociative acceptance, the how Mary is really privately a nice person story, colludes with the function of genocide. In this case, however, it is the witness who, by tacitly accepting Mary's viciousness, accepts the eradication of the humane as a joke. The world will then be full of monstrous Mary stories, tales of her beastliness. When we excuse the destructive behavior of anyone by citing their humanity, we commit a crime against the function of humanity. When we distance ourselves from collusive responsibility for the destructive effects of the vicious person by turning them into a joke of sorts, we pervert the truth. It is this corruption in the citing of humanity that perverts truth and that constitutes essential contextual support for any vicious person's successful establishment of the fascistic parts of themselves in the successful movement of the social group to its own fascism. The non-collusive witness to that personality change that occurs when the person crosses over from the sane to the insane parts of the self is initially shocked by this transference. We all know how stunning it is, when discussing an issue with someone, to witness the person's vicious espousal of a doctrine that derives part of its energy from the intellectual annihilation of the other. We may be speechless. Such a rupture also occasions a sense of dissociation. We feel immediately separated out from the conversant's insanity. And following this dissociation, part of us will feel deadened by the eruption, as now it is clear to us that the other is subject to an internal fascistic process. In a way, our response is our victimage. It is in feeling shocked, dissociated, and deadened that we share elements in common with those who are more severely traumatized by socially operant fascism. We may also share responsive qualities in common with a collusive witness, whereby we may try to recover from this trauma by reminding ourselves how, in so many other ways, this person is not only sane but likable. In this respect, we use our humanity and its link to the human parts of the other to recuperate from the trauma, but, as suggested, the irony of this is that it ultimately excuses and finally supports the destruction of humanity. Often we feel a certain dread as we sense our responsibility to those who are the objects of this person's intellectual genocide. We must say something that at the very least marks our opposition to the fascistic state of mind. When we exonerate a vicious person's actions by citing elements of their humanity, I think we create a perversion in logic itself, in thinking that is part of what we may consider the vicious circle. It is of interest that from the 17th century the word vicious was used to describe a fault in logic, when a conclusion was realized by false means of reasoning. Webster's third definition of the vicious circle cites this fault in logic, an argument which is invalid because its conclusion rests upon a premise which itself depends on the conclusion. The argument that Mary is really a good human being, in spite of her nefarious actions, because she is at the same time a human being, is a circular argument, a flawed logic that perverts the truth because it comes round full circle. Indeed, I use the word vicious to describe the person in a fascist state of mind not only because this word signifies one who is full of faults, which seems an apt description of one carrying moral voids determined by massive evacuations, but because we may also speak of a particular process, the vicious circle, which is definitionally affiliated with the vicious person, that suits my analysis of such a person as involved in a particular mental process. A vicious circle is also defined as a situation in which the solution of one problem gives rise to another, but the solution of this, or of other problems rising out of it, brings back the first, often with greater involvement. Another definition states, a situation in which one disease or disorder results in another, which in turn aggravates the first. It is exactly this type of process which, in my view, takes place in the fascist state of mind, whatever the anxiety or need that sponsors the drive to certainty, which becomes the dynamic in the fascist construction. The outcome is to empty the mind of all opposition, on the actual stage of world politics, to kill the opposition, a process that ironically undermines the vicious person. It does this by creating a moral void which further increases the underlying uncertainty, which set the mind on its pathological track to certainty in the first place. It is a procedure which Nietzsche regards as a virtue, the doctrine of eternal recurrence, that is to say of the unconditional and endlessly repeated circular course, italics mine, of all things 81. The cycle of purification through violent expulsion leaves a void which Nietzsche tries to fill with a notion of tranquility derived from the liquefaction of opposition. I swim and bathe and splash continually as it were in water. In any kind of perfectly transparent and glittering element, 48, which is possible until he meets up with any human element which fills him with a sense of disgust, 48. To the extent to which Nietzsche portrays early on the process of thought subsequently peculiar to the Nazi movement, we can see how the fascist sea of inner tranquility is mirrored by those horrid seas of internment camps that contain the fascists' vomit, the place that purifies them because it contains the indigestible opposition. For a person incarcerated in the concentration camp, it is hard to find any vestige of the human that could possibly offer resistance to the fascist state. In The Informed Heart, Bruno Bettelheim tells us that humane gestures expressed by one detainee to another were punished by death. One eventually could not help the other. Nor indeed could the subject express any of his feelings about the treatment meted out to the other and to oneself. Expression of feeling led to further torture and sometimes to extinction. Thus those qualities we value so highly as expressions of humanity, helping others in need and expressing our feelings and views, were eliminated. In that situation, incarcerated in Buchenwald, Bettelheim knew that to lose one's humanity was to risk personal madness. How could he remain sane? He discovered that it was through an ironic act sponsored by his extreme state. He would observe the SS, study them, consider at an intellectual remove what was taking place. If I should try to sum up in one sentence what my main problem was during the whole time I spent in the camps, he writes, it would be to protect my inner self in such a way that if, by any good fortune, I should regain liberty, I would be approximately the same person I was when deprived of liberty, 126. He had to accept, therefore, a split in his personality between the private world of his own thoughts, which ultimately were unreachable by the SS, and the rest of the personality that would have to submit and adjust for survival. 127. This is an extreme state of victimage in which the subject can only retain his humanity by preserving his sanity, which he accomplishes by accepting a split of sorts in his personality. It is interesting that thought and memory, the capacity to perceive reality, to think it and remember it, become the core of potential recovery to a humane future. We can see, then, why any person or group which has suffered a genocide must reach a point in the process of recuperation when remembering what actually happened is crucial. It is not only an action aimed at objectifying the crimes committed against the self, but, as Bettelheim hints, to recuperate from one's own destruction of the humane parts of the self in the interests of survival. As the victim seeks his own safety and deserts his fellow man, there will be an enormous loss of self-respect. Only through further self-analysis and self-expression can the victim recuperate that love of himself that is an ordinary part of the generative narcissistic structure of human relations. I suggest, therefore, that the ultimate human response to genocide is self-preservation, following physical liberation from the terms of aggression, this curiously inhuman side of the preservation of one's humanity, the will to survive, will move toward its abandoned humanities first by memory, then by speech, and finally by true grief. There is a triumph here of the seemingly inhuman, our Darwinian move, that is curiously more humane than the collusive acts of humanizing the monstrous parts of the self. If a person, group, institution, or country truly wishes to recover from the traumas of intellectual or physical genocide, then it will have to remember the crimes it has committed. The act of remembering is the antecedent to forgiveness of self and others, and instrumental to the reparative rehumanization of the group. This painful process is often bypassed by denials. It is water under the bridge, aimed to thwart recollection, and by transfers to the next generation, which is somehow meant to naturalistically displace the crimes of the older generation and absolve that generation from its collective responsibility. And as we know, a new generation, though seemingly possessed of its own displacing vision of the future, is highly liable to inherit the sins of the fathers.